Hi. So my name's Charlotte Mickelborg. Sorry I can't see you brilliantly because of the bright lights, but I shall try to see as many of you as possible. My background is as a BBC foreign correspondent. I left the BBC in 2009, largely because I felt that I couldn't tell the stories in depth that I wanted to tell. I was in China at that time and really was something of a one-man band, kind of researching, filming, producing everything myself. Sort of remote control, turn yourself on when you need to do a piece to camera type style. And I felt that I couldn't tell stories in depth. There weren't the resources and you weren't allowed the time. So I left to become a documentary filmmaker at that time. And I, shortly after that, started helping the UN, who were telling, who obviously have great access to the kind of meaningful stories that I, as a storyteller, wanted to tell, but didn't always have the in-house resources to know how to get those stories out to wider audiences. So the first film I made for them was called The Forgotten War, about the civil war in Congo, and we got that broadcast on 200 broadcasters worldwide, which was brilliant. For that UN agency that was quite small and lesser known, that was quite a coup. And early last year, I got involved, so I'm a relative newcomer, I got involved in VR, or more specifically at that time, 360 storytelling, and made a film called Born into Exile, a 360 film called Born into Exile, for the UN Population Fund that told the story of two pregnant women coming from Syria. It was really the story of how a pregnant woman kind of copes, I guess, in a war zone. And that got to show in the US Houses of Congress and the UN General Assembly, and actually directly had the result that the UN Population Fund were looking for, which was getting the US government, who'd been cutting funding, to recommit a whole lot more funding. This was all pre-Trump, obviously, to their cause. So I felt like, well, is this a fluke, or is there, is virtual reality, alternate reality, 360 having more of an impact than, my more conventional sort of filmic storytelling? And so I sort of started looking into that in my spare time, and obviously finding out statistics that I'm sure many of you may have heard already, like the original sort of 360 film Clouds Over Sidra that had raised donations on the street, or double donations on the street in certain countries, and other stats, and started to realize that there was something of a pattern here, that there was a lot of organizations with a higher end goal than just entertainment who are obviously investing in alternate realities. And increasingly, I think that there's not just a belief, but evidence-based proof that these kind of technologies are, for whatever reason, having a greater impact often than conventional film is having. And not only are those big organizations investing, but also, obviously, individual artists like these guys to my right, who are wanting to tell their own stories that stand for something, or that resist something, whether that be the rise of the far right, of terrorism, or in the case of one of our panelists, abuses of privacy. They are wanting to use these sort of filmmaking forms, these alternate forms to sort of make a point, to move people, perhaps move people more to action than conventional film does, or more often than conventional film does. So let me introduce them. This is Ali Eslami, who we're very lucky is joining us, because up until the last minute we weren't sure his visa was coming through. He's come from Tehran, and he has a project called the DeathTolls Experience, or just DeathTolls, I'm not sure. Experience. In the Millennium Gallery, which I urge everyone to see. He's an incredibly talented computer artist, and it's beautiful, apart from being very moving, which is obviously the key thing. So yeah, we've got Ali, we've got Shay, who doesn't have anything showing in this year's festival, but she's a force to be reckoned with from Amnesty International. She's their innovation manager, and they did have a project, I'm sure she's going to talk more about, called Syria 360, or do have a project called Syria 360. Darren, who is also a VR director and producer, he is co-founder of VR City and East City Films. Have I got that right, Darren? And you were the first to win, I think, a VR commission at Sheffield Doc Fest last year for a project that was called Invisible and is now called Indefinite, and is playing on the New York Times app. And Anna, who's a graduate of the Royal College of Art and is also a Google News Fellow, right? And has a project in the Millennium Gallery called Wikileaks, A Love Story, which is not just a love story, but it is a love story, among other things. So on that note, what I want to bring out from the panel today is what are the stories we're telling, in what ways do they kind of stand for something or resist something, and why choose these mediums that maybe don't always have the biggest audience, as big an audience as you might get from primetime television or something like that, but why choose these storytelling techniques? So should we start with Ali, as you're right here?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not a film. I have no idea about films and stuff. So I've been a gamer for a while, and then so my background is sort of attached to games, and somehow after that in 3D art, and I was making some 3D surreal stuff. So from 2014, I started to mess around with real-time 3D graphics. And then after a couple of years, I sort of managed to get my first VR headsets, which was quite a hassle to get the headset because these companies won't ship to Iran, of course. So they had to ship to my friend, and he brought it to Iran. So I had to wait for a couple of years to get my first VR headset. But the thing is, how I see VR, because I'm sort of settling down into VR development and sort of seeing it as a medium that I want to stay on it. How I'm seeing it, there are some metaphors attached to VR, and one of the strongest metaphors that I believe most of us sort of might agree is seeing VR as a window to somewhere that we cannot go, so we see it through a window. But how I would see it is more like a mirror to look back at ourselves, to sort of rethink our thoughts and see an aspect of ourselves that it's not possible to see it in a physical mirror or in any other context. So what I try to achieve in the project, which is being in the Millennium Gallery DeathTolls experience, is to visualize the horrific data that we already hear every day. I mean, it's a 50-50 chance to hear DeathTolls through the news. Just turn it on and you will hear it, I'm sure. So these numbers are being overly perceived, and when things are being overly perceived, they're getting naturally sort of filtered by the mind. Because it's like when you have a friend that is sort of always complaining about something, so you sort of say, oh blah, 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 or whatever, right? So this is what's happening with the news these days, especially with these numbers. And when these numbers are getting higher, getting huge, there's no mind model to perceive them. Like, how can you perceive 300,000 bodies, people who died? Or how can you accurately know what $110 billion is when there is a deal somewhere in Saudi Arabia? So these are big numbers that we have to be aware of. And I found VR as a good medium to sort of physically, bodily experience all these sort of horrific shit around us. So from the outcome and the feedbacks I got, I'm sort of getting confident about that it can work to make an experience out of data and let people have memories out of these boring data that we try to ignore every day.
Yeah, I think what's incredible about Ali's experience is some of you have probably already seen it, and if not, do go, because it's a really beautiful subliminal experience, although it's about something so incredibly depressing. And you do come out of it sort of, moved in a sense, in a negative way, in that you can't believe that you're really part of that. You're really part of that, not taking those numbers as seriously and poignantly as you should. But it's so beautifully done that actually you have I can't quite think of the word. It's not. You couldn't be described as calming, but you show it in such a calm, beautiful way that it is just so different from the way that you sort of digest those things in the news. One thing that I thought was really interesting in that experience is that obviously the way you represent death tolls in the West, and there is that whole point, I think, isn't there, about how we take it so seriously, and it is so serious when, a relatively small number of people die in Manchester, and yet, we're talking 312,000 or whatever it is dead in Syria. Right. It was interesting to me, why did you choose to represent the sort of Western death figures almost in a more realistic way? You'll see what I mean when you have the experience. And then the Syrian figures in that kind of dreamscape almost. Why did you make that distinction? I was curious.
Well, the thing is, first of all, I have to point this out, that I was trying to make a journey out of this. I mean, it was like a journey out of data. So I started to sort of making a storyboard for it, so I found this journey is better to be started from the middle of Europe to sort of first represent Paris attacks and Nice attack and all these incidents that had lots of impact in social media, safety checks and stuff like that, and people were sharing the news everywhere. And then you come to the Mediterranean Sea to see the refugees who drown in the sea. So it's just sort of in the middle of your way to reach the Middle East. And then you see 3,700 people who drowned last year in the Mediterranean Sea. And then at the end, you end up in the data set that represents 310,000 bodies, which is the casualties of the Syrian war. But the thing about this is, because it's gradually happening, it's like in the past 6 years, the numbers are growing, so they're adding up. So it loses its urgency. And because things are not happening like intensely like at the moment. So that's why it doesn't give enough media coverage. And generally, there is also a very absurd sort of oppression, I mean, sort of suppression in the Middle East area that, especially with the social media, for example, there was a terroristic attack in Tehran, unfortunately, last week, but no one, I mean, Facebook didn't provide any safety check or in Afghanistan or stuff like that. So, there is a very ignorant, there are some ignorance in any level of media about Middle East, and there should be some awareness, and there should be some interpretations to feel the tragic things that are happening in this very dark area, I mean, the region that is, I mean, the outcome is quite depressing, but it doesn't get enough coverage. I mean, so that's what I try to achieve, and I believe that there are lots of other data sets in these regions that needs to be interpreted. Again, that's $110 billion deal or any other thing.
What do you want people to take away from your experience in terms of, do you feel like it is a call to action of any description, the experience?
Well, the thing is, it's just a thing to trigger our perception of the data. So when you enhance someone's perception, it automatically, naturally affects our actions, because perception and action are in such a dialogue together. So our perception affects our action, and our actions builds up our perception. So this is sort of a way to affect people in that way, to just be aware of it and then do whatever you want. I mean, just know what happened. Yeah. Just be accurate.
I think I better move on along our panel, though that's fascinating. I'm sure we're going to come back to it in questions. Che, how did you, perhaps we can talk about that, what Ali's saying, though, which is obviously that this medium, you know, by representing DeathTolls in the way that he's done and using that technology, has left people with a different perception. And was that part of your goal in your project, Syria 360 project? Why did you choose that new medium to show? Yeah. Tell us a bit about the project, because I didn't, and then.
So I guess way back in January 2015, which feels like a lifetime ago, someone came into the office, the Amnesty International UK office, and kind of broke rule number 1 of innovation at Amnesty and said, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we did something with VR? And our rule is that you never start with the medium, you start with the problem that you're trying to solve. But they said, oh, look at this VR thing. I think we should do something with this. There's something in this. We should bring this to the we should use this for our work and bring it to the public. And we spent quite a while then scoping out, well, what could we do with VR? And that brought us back to the question of, hang on, why would we use it? What would be the appropriate thing to use VR for? And at the time, it was far more expensive than it is now, and we couldn't really afford to do the amazing film that we wanted to create with it. But we had been working for several years with a group of Syrian activists on the ground in Aleppo, and we knew that we wanted to take this collaboration with them further, and the anniversary of the Syrian civil war was coming up in just a couple of months' time from that. And we realised that actually we could do something quite special. Our primary aim was still to strengthen the activism going on the ground in Aleppo, and to bring new tools and techniques and skills to the activists we were working with there. We also knew that we needed to gather more information from Syria. So obviously research is a primary function of Amnesty, and 360 photography and film would actually enable us to do better research on the ground. And instantly, instead of flying out one of our researchers to, we're often kind of first on the ground when a disaster happens, but instead of flying out one of our researchers, actually our activists could take photos, take video footage, and our researchers could analyse that back in the office, so it was far more immediate. But also, we were then able to use that footage to create an experience for people in London as a starting point, and it's now spread across the UK, and it's in Edinburgh at the moment. And I think the images that we got from the ground, they're not anything that's different from what you see in the newspaper. So if we were just to present someone with those images, and this was the problem that we were having, is that we would show this street that had been completely destroyed and say, a barrel bomb has been dropped here, that's illegal, but people wouldn't even get past that picture because they see it all the time on the news or in the newspaper, and it wasn't meaningful to people anymore. There was just so much apathy, and we were finding it so hard to engage the British public on Syria because it felt endless and it felt like there was just nothing that we could do. But suddenly, when you put the headset on and you're inside the photograph, it gives you a completely different perspective of what's going on. And suddenly you realise that there were ordinary people on the streets in Aleppo who are seeing this scene, and you are almost in their shoes, and you're transported from London, the street in London, to a street in Aleppo, and someone's able to talk you through what exactly you're seeing, what used to be there, what's happened. And you realise that the street that you're on in London probably wasn't that different from that street in Aleppo before it was bombed. So it generated a huge amount of empathy, and I guess still that starting point of, oh, wouldn't it be cool to do something with VR, actually played in our favour, because VR then was still quite new to a lot of people, certainly. I mean, we were literally stopping people on the streets with our headsets, and a lot of people had never put on a VR headset before. So it definitely was a draw to get people in, to just try something new, and then the content was kind of the next step for them. And we'd never led with that before. Before we would lead with the content, lead with the problem, but actually our stop rates increased by 16%, which was just brilliant for us on an issue particularly on an issue that we were struggling to engage people on. And suddenly it kind of changed the narrative for us from Syria equals Assad and ISIS to Syria equals ordinary people on the ground, people just like us who are resisting. And that was crucial to kind of get that message through, that this isn't something that we have created in London, but this is something that has been brought to us from Aleppo. And that was so important to show, resistance is there, resistance is happening, civil society exists. And it was our way of kind of contributing to strengthening that with solidarity from London.
So your stop rate increased by 16%, 16.
Yeah.
Okay, but you also, I think, told me that the donations increased.
Yeah, so donations increased by 11%, which, to be honest, given that our primary aim wasn't fundraising, that was almost like a next step for us. We suddenly realised, as we were continuing with this project, like, actually, could we be covering our costs with this? And speaking to the fundraising team about it. But it did reinvigorate quite a tired fundraising channel for us, which is street fundraising. We had an online platform as well where people could use their own like cardboard goggles or access it, not using VR, but just like moving through the computer screen. And that also covered the costs of the camera equipment that we sent out to Syria.
You thought there was obviously a lot of noise around virtual reality, particularly in those very early stages. Was it end 2015, around that kind of time?
The start of 2015.
Oh, start of 2015. March, so obviously a lot of noise because it's so brand new. How will you, as innovation manager, take that forward at Amnesty? And do you feel like there's going to be a continuous pressure to innovate if you want to, perhaps, like you say, turn things on their head a little bit to how you've thought about it in the past, and make it not just about the story but also about the tech? Not that I'm saying it should be about the tech and not the story, but it obviously worked for you in that instance to kind of make it a little more about the tech because there was just that much more positive media coverage versus the normal negative media coverage for street side fundraising.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things for us is that we need to keep up with our audience, that there's no point us being in one place and our audience being in another place. So like absolutely VR, AR is something that we're continuing to explore. We also, because we're an international organisation, we took our work from London, we tried it out in Sydney first off, and they had very similar results. I mean, it's quite a similar environment there. So kind of that was great to consolidate what we'd learnt in London. We then also created a VR experience in our Nairobi office in Kenya around what was happening in South Sudan and refugees, and that specifically was for the African Commission, and it resulted in the African Commission's first fact-finding mission on what was happening to children refugees in South Sudan. So that was kind of phenomenal. And we are also scoping out projects now in Mexico and in Norway, both around our refugee campaign, global refugee campaign. And in the UK, we're kind of exploring what next with that work. We're continuing to exhibit Syria 360 because, sadly, the problem hasn't gone away, and we kind of can't bring that to the fore enough. But definitely, like, we're also exploring other issues that we can use VR for. Brilliant.
I'm sorry to stop you there, Shay, but just to make sure everyone gets a fair say here. So, Darren, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Indefinite. I've got it right, haven't I? It's not that I don't know the name, it's that it changed. And I'm particularly interested, and I'm guessing any other creators probably here are, because obviously to get your creation, your story, your experience onto the New York Times app, for example, it is a coup because it just gives you access to sizes of audience that not everybody has access to who's working in alternate realities, for example. I don't just want you to talk about that. I'm sure you want to talk about some other stuff, but it'd be great to sort of understand why you chose kind of the medium you did to tell your story, and in what ways you think that's been the right way to go versus some other more conventional sort of means of storytelling.
Okay, well, I mean, I'll start with a little brief explanation of what the film is, because it's not playing here this year. It was premiered sort of this time last year. It's a film that kind of exposes the detention system in the UK, and in particular, the use of indefinite detention in the UK. So we're the only country in the EU, whilst we're still in the EU, that has no time limit on detention. And really, the film is a journey through that detention system, through the testimony of around 6 people that take you through that journey. So we have somebody from beginning to end, telling different parts of that journey. So it's a series of sort of, I guess, vignettes that are knitted together to create one experience. I guess the main thing the reason I was interested in this, and I think I'm generally interested in social sort of kind of issues, And I came to this actually from a totally different story. I was researching a story about a stowaway, an immigrant who had come over in a plane, in the landing gear of a plane, and survived. And then I researched where he had ended up, where he had gone from hospital to then being placed in custody with the Home Office, and then had made it to a place called Harmondsworth, which is a detention center. And at that time, I didn't really know very much about detention centers and how they worked. And so, so through sort of researching one story, I ended up doing something else. And I guess my initial sort of kind of desire to make it was really a slight sense of guilt, in the sense that I didn't really know what was happening in my own country as far as our use of detention centers, and in particular the use of indefinite detention. So we began to kind of explore that, and really, the film has you meet kind of some really amazing people that have come from all over the world, and to be honest with you, had a very sort of kind of terrible sort of kind of experiences, where detention is just a small part of that, and it seemed to me grossly unfair that this country was treating people in this way. Where we look at ourselves, I most people here would look at the place that we live as a society that should be looking after people that are vulnerable and should be supporting them. And of course, the film itself doesn't campaign at all for the removal of detention centres. I think, having discussed with the charity that I work with called Detention Action, we agree that there is a need for some sort of detention centre to basically deport people, and that's what they're there to do. But it's the abuse of that system, where you have people sort of in detention centres for years, months, years, and the fact that they don't know how long they're going to be in there creates sort of psychological problems that and real harm to communities, especially when eventually most of them are released into the community but can't work and have suffered. And so I guess you could say they're now carrying sort of issues with them into society, which they wouldn't have had if they hadn't gone into that system in the first place. So the film's made. You mentioned the New York Times. I mean, luckily enough, the New York Times, Kathleen from the New York Times, saw the film here. I think for me, in terms of the medium, there was a slight frustration actually making it in VR, which is something that we were exploring, and I love making stuff in VR, but the idea that actually not that many people were going to see it. It's great for people at festivals to see it, but I wanted more people to see it, and not necessarily people that are maybe more in tune with documentary or kind of maybe left-leaning, and you kind of almost kind of preaching to the converted at festivals, I think. So it was kind of like, how do you get it out there? And I think the New York Times was definitely something that I was very, very keen on doing. They wouldn't give me stats for exactly how many people had watched it, but they did tell me, obviously that 6 million people had downloaded that app. So that gives you at least access to a large number of people. It was also taken by SBS in Australia, which was great as well, because they have their own really terrible detention, immigration detention system as well. So I hope the film sort of resonated there as well. So I think it was really good.
Yeah, so I guess what you're bringing out there really is that when you're considering, that you have the story you want to tell or the point of resistance that you want to make, and it's about not only, well, what is that story, what is that point, and how might the different technological platforms and possibilities lend themselves to that, but also, as you were saying there, what audience are you looking to reach? Is there just a very narrow audience of, you want this to reach Trump, or you want this to reach, this group of people? How, what might reach them? Like you say, will it be the New York Times app if you can, get your creation on there, or will it be something else? So it's those two things in a way to try and marry up, isn't it? What will lend itself to the storytelling, and what will lend itself to reaching the audience maybe that you want to reach?
I definitely felt that. I mean, VR was the right medium for it. We couldn't get access to detention centres. They're notoriously in this country completely off limits to press. I think there's only been a very few examples of people actually getting sort of imagery out from there. Also, our contributors were very nervous about, they didn't want to be on camera. So the whole, so you start off from a process, okay, I've got a story with the main location is off limits and the people don't want to be on camera. So it lends itself to kind of creating a world and putting people in that experience and using sort of, I guess, different techniques, abstract techniques, metaphor, all sorts of kind of stuff within a 360 video, which, you know, essentially it is with some CG compositing and all that kind of stuff. So it felt like the right medium. But yeah, as you said, there was sort of a reservation. I think there is, you know, people that work in VR here will probably know that there is a distribution issue in terms of VR, and also not only within the VR community, but also what type of VR you are able to see. So, you know, for example, the New York Times, you can watch it on your phone on the app, you can watch it on Gear VR, but you could also watch it on the desktop, which is great for numbers, but those experiences are slightly differ in terms of intensity and maybe emotional response to that, which as a filmmaker, you want everyone to kind of take off the headset and be really, really moved and, to action.
Yeah, there's an element of compromise there.
Yeah,
For what
exactly.
the audience is at the moment, you have to compromise, don't you?
Yeah.
Anna, I'm going to move on to you so we have enough time for questions. I'm very aware that probably lots of questions. So Anna, tell us a little bit about WikiLeaks and how it's resisting an abuse of privacy, essentially.
So I have an installation in the Millennium Gallery as well, which is a 4.5 meter long table with stacks and stacks and stacks of documents from WikiLeaks. And it's an augmented reality experience, which when you hold an iPad on top of it, you start to see this love story. Because for me, WikiLeaks, there's a huge problem there with how they've curated their information. Because in addition to all of the printed documents that you see on the table, which are all the things around kind of DoD contracting, CIA manuals, secret memos, all of the things that you naturally associate with WikiLeaks, there are also lots and lots of emails which were also released, some of them of incredibly personal nature. And what I've done is I've tried to contrast this political and personal through the experience that I've created. So when you hold this iPad on top of it, you start to see a love story between two people who fall in love and then break up, all of which is publicly available. This very intimate moment is publicly available on WikiLeaks. And what I found is that it provokes two reactions with people. So it's quite funny, and I think, because they call it, and it's quite cringy as well, which is terrible to say, they call each other stud muffin and baby cakes, and it's just really, you know, it's like, I don't love you, I love you, I love you. And humor is a really good way to draw people into these kind of really difficult conceptual conversations, because if you talk to some people, particularly young people, like, I'm going to have a conversation with you now about data privacy, people don't necessarily want to talk about that. It's quite dry and it's quite boring. But if you give them something that is amusing, and also a love story I found was, because there are thousands of personal human scale stories that actually you can find in WikiLeaks. It's not just all of these big political machinations. If you give someone something that is quite universal, that everyone can relate to, it just, again, it stops it being this kind of like huge abstract conceptual thing, a bit like Ali's work. It stops it being this thing that, you know, is, and brings it to something that is relatable. So you start to have conversations with people about whether it's right, when is it in the public interest to release this information, when is it not? Should there be more of a curatorial process? Because WikiLeaks say that they will only release stuff that has significant political or diplomatic, that is significant diplomatically or political, when really this isn't the case. And the other thing, and the other reasons why I wanted to make it an augmented reality experience is because when you see this giant stacks of paper, 4.5 meters, that's kind of like twice as tall as I am, you're confronted by the fact that these documents, these emails, they're real things. You tend to kind of think about kind of like the digital as being ephemeral, it's there, you delete it, it's gone. It's not. Like, all of the documents in WikiLeaks are real things that were scanned and then uploaded. And so returning them back to this their physical nature reminds people of the physicality and realness of emails, because the emails that I found were written 4 years before they were released. So you can start to have interesting conversations as well around the right to forget in a digital age, because, who owns your emails? If you're using a work account, those emails don't belong to you. If you're emailing someone with a work account, those emails don't belong to them. So we're giving data, we're giving information away, we have no control over it, and we have no kind of way of accessing this and erasing it 5-10 years later if we don't own it. And so I've been doing some workshops with some young people, and it's a really good way, this experience. And I get them to download it on their phone, and they can move through it to then start to engage with those difficult things. So who owns stuff? Why are you putting this online? Do you understand the issues around ownership, where it can go, and all those kind of things?
It's a really good point, actually, using that as a means to teach young people more about privacy, which isn't naturally an interesting topic for them, but it's obviously going to be completely key. It's already key in our generation, but it's even more key, I expect, in theirs. I should just say, because I misunderstood this with Anna's, obviously she's resisting the abuse of privacy. She hasn't named...
Yes,
I
have to
she
say...
hasn't used any of their personal information, but those people are not named in her installations, worth mentioning.
I have redacted it as much as possible. But it is now, for those people involved, when anyone Googles their names, if they apply for a job, if they, whatever, that is one of the things that comes up for them, because they had no control over how that information was then released into the public domain.
Thanks, Anna. With only 20 minutes left, or just under, I want to open up for questions, because I'm sure there's lots of people wanting to ask them, and sorry it took us so long to get to questions. Who would like to go first? Anyone? Is there a mic? Hi. Can we get you a mic, or do you want to... Oh, yeah, there's a mic coming. Do you want to shout? Up to you.
Hello. Thank you very much for sharing your work. I wanted to ask about a sort of running theme of your work is about raising awareness about these important subjects in a world where we are overwhelmed by negative, difficult imagery in the news, and the news makes us want to shut down from what's actually happening. And I was talking with some friends about this the other day, and a question that came up was, what would an empowering version of learning about what's going on in the world be for the general public? What would that look like? And I guess kind of seeing you guys talk about your work made me think, well, maybe it would look a bit like this. And I was just wondering if you guys have your own answers to that. And what would a form of learning about the difficult things that are going on in the world, but in a way that's not going to shut down people, but help them understand and access their empathy and stuff like that, look like? What kind of things would you use?
Anybody want to go first?
Yeah. Apart from VR development and working on VR in the last few months, I studied a lot about cognitive science and phenomenology, and basically how we think metaphorically. So I believe disciplines like cognitive science and phenomenology are really important.
What was the first thing you said? I didn't catch
Cognitive
it.
science
Cognitive
and
science,
phenomenology.
sorry. Okay.
Yeah. So these are very important sort of disciplines that we, as VR creators, because VR is basically the most phenomenal subset of technology. So we also need to sort of see what they say about human phenomena, and so the way we think metaphorically, and how we started to learn everything with bodily experiences as a child, how we learned what containment is in a glass. So these are very basic metaphors that we started to learn, and when we grow up, these are sort of evolving to some conceptual metaphors, like freedom, like big numbers, or anything which is conceptual. So I believe VR is quite is a good platform to see in practice, sort of have explain these conceptual metaphors with bodily experiences that is quite intuitive enough for us to explore. So the more bodily it gets, the more intuitive and the more
So we're kind of going back to, so from a traditional media in which we're just experiencing sort of visual and oral experiences, we're making that more bodily, more multisensory, taking it back to more sort of getting people involved from a more childlike perspective in a sense. I think as well that what's really interesting and what I haven't seen that much of, I've seen a bit of, is communal experiences. I think that the power of and I don't quite know how these would look. I'd be fascinated to hear from anyone who's creating them. But communal experiences that you could have through different kinds of tech would be powerful, because we're in such an individualistic society, and given the rise of certain very frightening groups within our societies, I think that we all have to consider being a little less individual and a bit more sort of communal and kind of, getting together. I don't mean sort of a them and us getting together necessarily, but, more togetherness, because, you resist more effectively as en masse than you do sort of as individuals, and how these experiences could be more communal, because at the moment a lot of them are just, you go into it and you come out of it, and then, you don't have so much of that. So, yeah, so that was just chiming in. But did anyone else want to answer that question, or should we go for the next one?
Well, just from, I think it's a really, really good question. And sorry, Ali's answer was so interesting. I'm going to ruminate on that probably for the rest of the day. But I guess from our perspective at Amnesty International, the more authentic something is, the more likely you are to break down those barriers and create empathy. And for us, so at Amnesty Speak, we refer to rights holders. So obviously we all have human rights, but around any given issue, there will be particular rights holders, like people who hold those human rights. And it's really key that I think that we have active, authentic, meaningful participation from rights holders on any given issue, and that is really what starts to kind of break down those barriers and also make sure that we really remain true to those issues, and that we're not speaking for people but allowing them to speak for themselves and giving them the space and the platform. So yeah, from our perspective, I think that would be part of the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a cop-out answer from me, which I don't think there is one sort of kind of medium, and I feel like what we have here is in this room as well is people looking at different disciplines of ways of telling story. We're constantly looking at how we can tell the stories that we want to kind of sit down and speak to each other about. So whether that we had people talking about games and VR and traditional film, and I think it's incumbent on people to keep trying to tell those difficult stories in different ways, and it might be one thing that cuts through the noise. And I think it's probably the goal is to cut through the noise and to make something that sort of kind of resonates with everybody. And that could be something that's site-specific, which is theatre. It could be all sorts of different things, but it needs people to kind of explore those mediums, I think
it's worth also exploring different emotions, because obviously all of these topics are important and meaningful, and they're often sad, but sadness and depression are not, luckily, the only human emotions. And I think that those stories and experiences that can sort of make you laugh or make you smile, as well as making you feel, moved in a slightly more depressive way, maybe. But those experiences that can kind of marry those two. This is a very serious topic, but that doesn't mean that nobody ever smiles in Syria, or and those things that can, in a way, like Anna's piece plays on our natural instinct for voyeurism. I think we're all going to go and see Anna's piece now, and that's why we're not just we're a bit of everything. And I think those experiences that can bring that out are perhaps more successful as experiences. Oh, sorry, Dan, you do. Should we go there first, or Dan? Go on. I'll come to you next.
I wanted to pick up on your point about communal experience. In curating today, dubbing the afternoon togetherness, I wanted to talk about people doing experiences together now. I've chosen two projects to show in the Millennium Gallery. Go and see Anna's piece, also go and see Ali's piece. And I wonder, do you notice a difference when people do your experiences together, and in your film and your films as well? is there a profound difference from the single user? I know your piece is kind of multi-user, but is there a profound difference in audience interaction? And do people feel more connected to each other after they've been through your immersive experiences together?
That's a good question, actually. Well, if you put down the technical barriers that there still is, the thing that is a big question now is, so what's going to be your body? What's going to represent your body in VR? If you want to experience it together, so because you want to see someone and experience with that someone again, but that body should be rethink carefully, and something that represents the guy, and not as a typical avatar that we see in these social VR experiences. There are some generic sort of bubbles on your heads. So I believe that body part needs to be quite developed, and that's a part that has to be sort of answered first. Then we have to think about what happened together.
Anybody else desperate to answer on that one before we go on to our next question?
I could just say quickly that one of the nice things that I liked about working with AR rather than VR is that it does enable two people to kind of share an iPad and go through the experience together and kind of have conversations at the same time. And you can have, so I've seen multiple people kind of like point at the iPads, kind of like to kind of share. So it does become more of a communal experience, I think, than VR, which is something to bear in mind when you're kind of like thinking about the best way to tell a story. Like, do you want that type of interaction to happen?
I think with my film, I mean, it is VR, so it's people experiencing it sort of in isolation. And kind of as a counterpoint to what you were saying earlier, like I feel that the intensity of the isolation of experiencing something is very important. And I think maybe we'll look back at this period in this medium and kind of slightly misty-eyed when it's going to go probably further and further into communal VR, that we'll miss the fact that we were able to just focus on something, especially when, you know, my phone's constantly, you know, kind of making noises and people are tweeting and this and that, you know, just to have that period of 10 minutes to actually engage in a story and be immersed in that is actually quite valuable. I think actually it's more for VR in an isolated sense, it's more, the communal experience is more a question of curation, I think. And you see kind of good examples of it at the gallery here in terms of the thought process that goes in between the leading up to having that experience and then afterwards. And I've always sort of been a big advocate for people sort of coming together after they've experienced a film in isolation and then sharing experiences after that and needing to almost sort of decompress. I think that would be quite useful in terms of a next step for VR cinemas. With a group session afterwards.
Group session. Your question, sorry.
Thank you to the panel for their interesting presentations and also the very moving work that I've had the pleasure of seeing some of. I wonder, do any of the panel think that VR in particular is dangerous? Is the fact that VR is really an empathy machine something that currently is working very powerfully to articulate important stories, for example, around Amnesty and DeathTolls, but could it be used by other bodies, storytellers, to present points of view which we are much less sympathetic towards, and it could be used as a powerful propaganda tool? I come from a factual documentary maker background, and I want people to be moved by the stories I tell, but I also need them to be informed. And because we're living in an age, an anti-expert age, we've got a lot of people making decisions, as we've seen in the last few days, on the basis of feelings without a lot of information behind them. So I guess my question is, as well as all the possibilities it's opening up, is it also potentially a dangerous technology and storytelling tool?
Anyone want to go on that? I can go if not.
I would say yes. It has that capability. Yes, of course, like most mediums do, whether that's a pamphlet or a book or whatever. I think the fact that it's so intense, that it has a kind of that visceral sort of nature, means that the experiences, I guess, could be used in a sort of an ethical sort of kind of way. but at the same time, I feel like, and it kind of goes to a wider issue about ethics and VR and how we sort of govern the experiences that come out of this sort of new medium, because it's a new industry, you know. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but I do believe, yeah, there's the possibility for that, for sure. And I think having made lots of VR, even if my intentions are good, that I need to be careful about what I present. So in Indefinite, there's a scene where somebody sets fire to themselves that's quite intense. You know, it's not necessarily, should there be a warning? Should there be an age limit? And normally at festivals like this, there is a sort of age limit that's put in place, really by the curators themselves. But yeah, because people will point to the idea that you're sort of kind of creating such intense experiences that they maybe create memories, or, you know, and how do you sort of kind of then process that? So I think it's a really interesting question that I don't think people are wrestling with. And I know, like, sort of kind of the journalism schools, the Knight Foundation are wrestling with kind of ethics around that sort of stuff as well.
Which I think is almost another question as well. What's your moral responsibility as a storyteller? I think my only chime in on that is, like Darren, I think like any medium, it can be abused, but the good thing is most of the creatives lie on the right side of that political spectrum. So we definitely are a force to be reckoned with. But who would like to ask the next question? There we go. You need a mic? Are you gonna? Thank you.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while, and it's an exciting panel to ask this to. Around a lot of the work you've created is potentially offering advocacy for a voice in society that might not be able to speak for itself. And we talk about the empathy machine, but I'm interested in how we engage those subjects in using the technology itself, as there becomes a broader distinction in access between individual wealth to arts and technology generally. So how many of the people your work is about get to use your work? Do they know about it? What do they think? And more broadly, until headsets become more available, do we see that? How do we stop that divide increasing?
Yeah, I mean, Indefinite, you know, it's been out for a year, and it's been to lots of kind of film festivals, but we've also taken it to charities that are working within the community that the film is about. So we actually did a screening at Amnesty, not for Amnesty, but for another group that's using the building. We're touring it ourselves, actually, you know, so it was kind of self-funding that, really. Well, I should try and get some funding for it, but to sort of places that are looking after asylum seekers, and trying to get people sort of to see it and to comment on it, really, because I feel like when making the film, the people that we were sort of working with were actually in many cases very fragile. They're in really desperate parts of their lives. So, you know, that you have to have some sort of collaboration with them to make sure that you're kind of representing them properly and making sure that they are seeing it before it kind of gets out there, that they feel that it's a true sort of representation, even if it's a very creative representation of what their experiences is, because there's a responsibility there as a film or experience maker to do that. But I also think sort of, I mean, it goes back to my earlier point. I feel like the people that I really want to see it are not necessarily people that have been through that experience, because you know, why put them through that again? But it's really the people that dismiss that community or other, you know, look at immigration and people as others and paint them as, you know, people that are either sort of after their jobs or like coming over here in droves or infestations of, you know, they're the sort of people that I think, given the sort of the very sort of clear divide there is in the media, especially in this country, is between right wing and left wing. You know, I think it's important to, certainly given the election that's just happened, where there was a lot of kind of differing voices, to try and get those messages to people that wouldn't normally get them, that are stuck in their own sort of echo bubble. So, you know, I think that's sort of more important in many ways.
Can I speak to that as well? So something that we really wanted to do this year, I mean, like Dan, what we created, you don't need to show that to a person in Syria because like they're right there and they can see it. But what we had planned to do at the start of this year was to create a VR experience here that we could send back to our communities in Syria. So to show them, like, this is the impact, this is what people look like, this is what their faces look like when they're seeing your work for the first time. Because it's incredibly powerful to watch someone using VR for the first time and someone like having this very intense reaction. But also, like, there are some video clips that we use which are really wonderful stories, like about a baby who survived a bombing attack, and like it's just amazing when they pull the baby out of the rubble and everyone's celebrating, and and you get the most wonderful reactions from people seeing that. So what we planned to do was to create an experience and also to take some 360 photographs and footage of solidarity rallies that we'd had or events outside the Syrian embassy. And unfortunately, because of what happened in Aleppo at the start of the year, it became impossible for us to get that to them. And the group that we were working with, Lambda Media Productions, is what they came to be known as through our work. They kind of disbanded, moved to different places as they were evacuated from Aleppo. But doing something like in the reverse, I think would be, that's something we really, really wanted to do and would still quite like to explore.
Yes.
I can also add a point about it. There's sort of a big challenge in terms of reaching an impact to an audience in VR, because most of the users who are trying VR, you might try your project for first time. There's a big chance that it's their first VR experience. So then that's the hard part of it, because your project, I mean, your piece should be sort of in a way that overshadows the tech part of it, because mostly when you try VR for the first time, you get hyped out by just being in VR. Whatever you're seeing is not important. Just seeing a perspective through two screens in front of your face. So that's a hard thing to reach the general audience who haven't tried VR ever, and you wanna show your
kind of thing.
Yeah, this sort of overshadows the concept, I guess.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I think we're sort of exiting that period now. I mean, depending on where you are in the world, of course. In certain places you wouldn't be, but in the UK, the US, and the sort of more developed markets that have already had a couple of years' experience in the alternate reality space, we're maybe getting past that. But no, it's a very valid point when it comes to other places. Have I got time for any more questions? No, I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all our panelists.